D-Day. Oh, no. What? It's you didn't like it. So you're saying
All right, let's make first off. All right, so did we get to D-Day?
Yeah, we got it.
Second front. All right, we're going right from there. Oh, just to review, what did the United States do to Japan right after the Japanese took French Indochina, and I guess part of it was also that awful war in China? What did the United States do to Japan? Yeah, they embargoed what product? Oil. And then the Japanese decided, okay, we will not back down, we'll not surrender. What's the code of the samurai called again? Bushido. Yeah, Bushido. And what area did they decide to attack to get their own oil? What colony? Yeah, what's Indonesia now? What is it? Dutch East Indies. The Dutch East Indies. And that is why they attacked at Pearl Harbor. What was the turning point battle in the Pacific? The Battle of Midway. So we got to this, we got second front, and we're not going to cover this very much. Got handed out that worksheet, or handed out what we saw in the video. That's Omaha, that's Utah. By the way, you know what that means? Strap in the back of the helmet. Officer. Vertical stripe is an officer, so his men can see from behind. If it's horizontal, it's a sergeant. See, we learn all kinds of stuff. Well, the thing about is that the plan was for slow advance across France. Germany sent everything they could to try to bottle them up in Normandy, and in August, the Allies broke out. And it happened so suddenly that it shocked the Allies to the extent of how fast they broke out. In fact, France was liberated in less than a month. The problem is for the Allies, they outran their supply lines. And by the time they got to the German frontier, they were out of fuel, out of supplies. They were hoping to end the war, but before fall, once the German army broke apart, they thought, we're going to advance into Germany. But no. And that winter, they're going to be on this line right here. The Russians, steamrollers moving here and sweeping through the Balkans. The last German counterattack was the Battle of the Bulge. Massive battle in Belgium and Luxembourg. It would create kind of a bulge in the Allied line. But not only did the United States stop them, but it would turn out to be America's greatest victory of the war, maybe greatest military victory ever. Now, the Allies really worried, oh my gosh, if the Germans could do a counterattack, this war might go on longer than we were hoping. As it turned out, this was the end of the German. This was the end of their supplies, they were end of their reserves. They had almost no oil left. Remember, they attacked Russia for oil. Germans of the advance, those Americans. In March of 1945, once the waters begin to go down, this Russian steamroller attack, and then the Allies, the French, the British, the Americans, the British and the Canadians attacked. But in February, the night of 13th and 14th of 1945, fearful that the Germans still aren't surrendering, the British started at night and the Americans bombed during the day. Over 1,000 planes bombed the city of Dresden. And this was the next really big firebombing after they tried one in Hamburg back in 43, which I mentioned on Monday, where 43,000 Germans died in Hamburg. And this was an effort, basically a terror bomb, to force Germany to surrender. And the Allies are going to hide the extent of the damage because Dresden had not been bombed. There were hardly any factories. And there were hundreds of thousands of refugees fleeing the eastern part of Germany, fleeing the Soviet army. And so we don't know how many people died. So when the Soviets kept saying this was a horrible attack and the British and the Americans denied it happened. And so when it finally became acknowledged, they said 90 to 100,000. we believe it's closer to 40 to 50,000 people died. In one of the biggest firestorms of the war, Dresden was absolutely devastated. This is going through the ruins. These are actually American POWs. There's not only refugees, but American and British prisoners of war were up there. Yeah, the city just south of Berlin. It's one of the most beautiful. It was supposed to be one of the most beautiful cities in all of Germany, and was absolutely destroyed. Kurt Vonnegut, one of my favorite fiction authors, was an American POW. He sheltered in this slaughterhouse. That's where he sheltered, called Slaughterhouse 5, and one of the great books of the post-war era would be called Slaughterhouse 5. But it was also in the Soviet zone of occupation. And this was a little message to the Soviets. You might have the Red Army. You might have the most powerful ground force, but look at the awesome power of Allied air forces. This was a message to the Soviets too. And once this happened, right after that, the Allies began firebombing every German city. That's Dresden, that's Berlin. Just devastating towns. March of 45 was a massive raid in Berlin that killed 25,000 people. That's why if you go to Germany today, almost every major town, at least 3/4 of it, at least half to 3/4, was totally destroyed in the war. Just devastating. These last few months, it's one of the awful things about total war. Germany was, and now, especially with hindsight, we know, completely defeated. It was just a matter of, they're done. It's over. And yet the bombing is going to get worse. And the killing is going to get worse. Well, this would be the final offensive, and the German army collapsed. There was a desire by some in the West to try to take Berlin, but that was in the Russian occupation zone. So the Allies went down here. We saw that in the video, the Titanic battle for Berlin of over 1 million casualties in Berlin. The Soviets would take it, and Berlin would fall. There is the Brandenburg Gate, German POWs. I like this one in the Tiergarten. And the Triumph Memorial right in the middle for the German victory in 1871 over France. Soviets took it. And the day, victory in Europe, May 7th, they surrendered. 8th was the formal ceremony. There's Field Marshal Keitel surrendering to the Allies, to the Western Allies, and Germany is defeated. But the thing was, they're still in the Pacific. And the United States is tied to this unconditional surrender. And as they slowly begin to push back on Japanese-held islands, the strategy would be called island hopping. At first, the thought was the U.S. are going to have to take islands, use the islands as a base to attack the next island, and so on. But at the end of 43, they realized that the Japanese fleet was in much worse shape than we realized. And so they started skipping very heavily defended places like Revoll right here in New Britain Island, or Truk right here. They just skipped over, hopped over the heavily defended ones, and attacked other islands and got closer to Japan. For example, the Marianas Islands right here were taken at the same time as D-Day. And from these islands, B-29s could start bombing Japan. So they're getting closer and closer. The thought was it's still going to be till 1946. And you can imagine after Germany surrendered, it's like, is this war going to end? And the thought was, are we going to have to force an invasion of Japan to get them to unconditionally surrender? There's going to be almost a desperation to try to figure out a way to end this war. Now, Germany, it made sense, the unconditional surrender. The Nazi state was, and fascism was a massive threat to civilization. Now, Japan, a brutal military dictatorship for the most part, but it was still a war for empire. It's just colonies. Every place are colonies. So, in Japan, total desperation. So we talked about Bushido, and they're trying to find an honorable peace. And the big thing is they want to be able to keep the emperor, keep the basic structure of Japan intact. They know they've lost. They know they can't win a war. But if they can make it so horrible with attrition, make it so horrible, the US would force them to negotiate peace. Some kind of peace agreement terms, not unconditional. And the emperor, there's gonna be a few other things, keep the basic structure, but all focused around the emperor. And as a measure of their desperation, in the fall of 44, when the US tried to take back the Philippines, that's when Japan would resort to kamikaze. But they would really use it at Okinawa. This was an act of pure desperation to make the war so horrible that the Japanese would be willing to use suicide bombs. They never, no way would they ever do it and risk a trained, experienced pilot and have them kill themselves. No way. But it's relatively easy to take off a plane. It's relatively easy to steer a plane. Landing's the hard part. And they're out of oil. The whole thing was to get oil, and they were literally running on fumes by the fall of 44. Heck, by 43. So they even had rocket propelled ones, weren't that effective, but terrifying. But it was just to make the war so horrible that the US would negotiate this. So as they got closer, Philippines, the Pelevu was hell on earth for the first Marine Division. Iwo Jima, right here, this has been a Japanese island for directly or indirectly for 500 years. Just a little tiny island. And in April of 45, they're going to take Iwo Jima, not much bigger than Helena Valley, yet it had 3 airfields, so it'd be used for escort planes for B-29s. It was dominated by a volcano. I thought that was a pretty good picture of the Marines on the landing craft. Over 21,000 Japanese defenders were dug in all over the island, caves in the rocks. It was still an island of ash, and it was still steaming hot. It was literally hell on earth. And that's taking Mount Suribachi. That's what it looks like. This is about 7 years ago. This picture was taken in there. Now it actually has vegetation. Back then it was still ash. I just found that kind of fascinating. Most of you have probably seen this picture. The second flag that was raised on Mount Suribachi. An AP photographer just happened to snap this picture and become one of the most famous pictures of the war. That's the Marine Memorial today. If you go to Washington, D.C. So I took that picture, then on one where you can see the Washington Memorial. I think it's one of the most beautiful places around. Arlington National Cemetery is right over here. No idea who that guy is. So, just some guy who's there. Now, I put the total numbers of dead. The exact numbers are as important to understand as this. Virtually every defender, they would not surrender. Only a couple hundred surrendered. And 7,000 Marines and sailors died. This was a total Navy operation. There was no army. Is this what it's going to be like if they attack the Japanese homeland? How do we get them to unconditionally surrender? And you can see just a little bit of vegetation. I guess a place where they would dig in and would start smoking. It would be over 150 degrees into the little foxholes they would try to dig to get a little bit of protection. Iwo Jima. Then Okinawa, even closer. Japanese consider this part of their home islands. And so April all the way through June. And this too, the southern part of the island, over 120,000 Japanese held this tiny little bit of this island. Not a lot bigger, this area, than Helena city limits. And they held every square inch of it. And they had to be rooted out with flamethrowers or satchel charges, bombs. And that's for over 3,000 kamikazes attacked. So they could produce planes and they just had enough fuel to fly down. In fact, the remaining Japanese fleet, they were going to do the same thing. They had just enough fuel to sail down from Hosan Island and attack Okinawa for a dramatic end of their fleet. American carrier planes sunk almost all of them. Killed about 7,000 sailors. The fighting was just unbelievable. Once again, is this what the invasion is going to be like? Now, once again, the numbers aren't as important, but to get the idea of what happened, over 111,000 had to be killed, but more surrendered than ever before. Look how many ships were sunk by almost all kamikazes. They kept that secret from the American public. Kamikazes, it was just terrifying. You put a blanket anti-aircraft fire, pilots will want to, they don't want to die. They want to be able to fight again. So they turn around. Kamikazes kept coming. It was terrifying. Look how many Marines and soldiers mostly died. It's still one of the biggest American cemeteries in the world is on Okinawa. Is this what invasion's going to be? So we got to backtrack a little bit. We're coming up now. Just had the biggest amphibious operation in the world. The invasion of Japan would be the biggest ever. Much bigger than what we call D-Day now. Okinawa is huge, and Japan would be even bigger. So let's backtrack. At Yalta, now I originally was not going to tell you this, but I'll go over it later. I was just going to tell you one thing really quick and come back at the beginning of the Cold War, but I'm going to tell you this now. At Yalta, Yalta's in Crimea. This is the last major meeting of the Big Three. Stalin picked the place right here. Crimea was devastated by the fighting. He wanted the British and the Americans to see what the Soviet Union had done. Churchill, FDR, Stalin, and Churchill was kind of being iced out because it was clear now they represented the two most powerful countries coming out of the war. And he had just won his fourth term, and he was noticing this. What he had gone through in his life and being president for as long as he was, through depression and now war. And they're talking post-World War. One important thing is, going back to that idea of the League of Nations, but now the United Nations. But the most important part of the United Nations, that's why I put it in italics, was the Security Council. It would have 5 permanent members, 6, now 10 other members. So now it's 15 members. They make all the big decisions for the United Nations. The 5 permanent members, US, UK, France, Soviets, China. Even though China was in the middle of a civil war and in the Japanese invasion, FDR wanted something to counterbalance Japan and the Soviets. And they each had a veto. So anything that came out of the Security Council, those 5 countries could veto. They make all the important decisions. And that would avoid the issues of, remember Article 10, I'll put a number 10 there instead of the Roman numeral, just make sure you remember that. Remember Article 10 from the League of Nations, that idea of collective security? That would avoid that problem. The problem is this: if you have 5 countries with a veto, is anything ever going to get out of the Security Council? And this is what you have to add. That's going to make the UN very weak. To this day, the UN is weak. You can imagine during the Cold War, anything the United States or the West wanted, the Soviets, then later the Chinese vetoed, or vice versa. So, for example, today, anything about what Israel is doing in the occupied territories for the '67 war, the West Bank and Gaza, the US vetoes. Doesn't matter if everybody else is for it, doesn't matter, the US vetoes. Or for that matter, what's happening in Ukraine, of course the UN can do nothing about Ukraine because Russia now has that veto. So the UN, yes, it can do some, it does some, I would say, very good things, but it's always going to be hobbled by this. Also, war crime trials, most famously the Nuremberg trials in Nuremberg. Remember the Nuremberg laws? They chose that on purpose. And it would be done by a tribunal of judges from the British, United States, and the Soviet Union. Well, let's be clear about it. The victors decide what a war crime is. But yeah, there are war crimes committed by Japan and Germany. But did the victors do something? Next, Germany's going to be divided up into 4 occupation zones: Britain, France, the United States, and the Soviet Union. Berlin will be divided up into 4 occupation zones: Austria will be divided too. But that would turn out to be a big controversial issue. Austria would just be made a country in the 1950s and be neutral. So here's the US. So for example, when the US, for the first time in its history, brought the peacetime draft, and they would begin to put troops there in case of Soviet attack, the US would eventually have 600,000 troops. Still have 40,000, including my dad. And French, British, Berlin, right in the middle. I should add a big hunk of Eastern Germany with the Poland. And all the people who lived there would be forced out at gunpoint. Next, Russia pledged, and you notice I put it in quotes, re-elections in Eastern Europe. So every place from Bulgaria up, but the big one was Poland because that's where the war started. But you notice I put it in question, in quotes. Stalin didn't think the FDR and Churchill were serious. Yeah, we'll have free elections, as long as they pick somebody who's allied to the Soviets. He will never allow enemy states between him and Germany. He wants a buffer zone because Germany might come back again. It's already happened twice. Remember, Germany defeated defeated Russia in World War I and nearly did in World War II. And Germany would pay reparations. The Allies didn't like this because it was such a big deal after World War I. But 20 billion to repair, because the western part of the Soviet Union was a wasteland, which the Western Allies never acknowledged. Yalta was a big deal. Now, a lot of people think that Roosevelt was tricked here, but remember, the Soviet Union had 15 million men in the Red Army. They're going to dictate the terms in the area that they liberated. This was a tough one. Lastly, this is what FDR cared about. The Soviets would enter the war 3 months after VE Day. And they would get maybe occupation zones in Japan. The big thing is they would get the Sakhalin Island, which they do now Russia have, maybe some of the Kuril Islands. They thought they might get a hunk of Manchuria and just annex it on the Amur River. And Roosevelt looks pretty sick. He was noticeably sick. Remember I told you how he could walk? Did that kind of thing where he shifted and walked by 45 years. So when he gave the State of the Union address, when he got back, he had to sit. So to many US conservatives after the war, this will be like appeasing. They said that you're appeasing the Soviet Union. Here's Stalin taking all the chips. And remember, that city, Yalta, will become Munich. And you'll hear this for years. I still hear this. People talk about it. Usually they don't know what they're talking about, but they know enough to mention Yalta, which is Munich. Those are people who should know better. But it was much more complex than this. So, they thought in January, Germany might last for 5 or 6 more months. It had 2.5 months to go when they ended Yalta. And then FDR died in April. And now the new president, that's at his funeral, FDR was the president. I mean, in your conscious life, you really only had 2 presidents, really. I mean, I imagine some of you remember Obama, but it's kind of just foggy. You know, some of you followed it. You've had, most of you were born when George W. Bush was president. Is that right? You're born. Yeah, if you're born in was anybody? No one was born in 09, were they? Yeah, so George W. Bush was president when you guys were born. Yeah, you probably I doubt you remember him. But think about if you had president who's elected for 4 terms. He was the president. So, and now he's the new president. FDR's third vice president. It was kind of pushed on by Southern Democrats, angry about his liberal choice named Henry Wallace. Harry Truman. He was, to say he's unprepared was one of the biggest understatements in history. He knew nothing. For example, he didn't know about this thing called the Manhattan Project until the day he became president. He had no idea. Roosevelt hardly talked to him. I mean, literally, hardly talked to him. Yes, he was a relatively prominent senator, but unknown outside of the Senate and his home state of Missouri. And he was desperate. He had a pathology his whole life to look tough. Partially because he had to have a sheltered life because he had glasses at such a young age. Now, glasses might not seem like a big deal now, if you have glasses, whatever. But back in the at the turn of the century, glasses shattered really easy. And they were more expensive than this family could afford to buy another set. So they wouldn't let him play or do things with other kids. And that affected his whole life. He was desperate his whole life to prove he was tough. This might have some issues down the road. And he stuck with unconditional surrender. So he was informed that we had this thing called the Manhattan Project, which blew him away. Even though he really wasn't told what it was, a bomb will destroy the city and it would cap the atom. He knew what the atom was, but not just because he's read. He's very well read. A massive $2 billion project all across the United States to create an atom bomb. And the race was on with Germany. The assumption was that Germany was working on it. And even though by 42, we were sure Germany wasn't probably, it wasn't until VE Day that we knew for sure that Germany had abandoned it. They didn't have the resources and probably never would. But still. And Los Alamos, New Mexico is where it be constructed. That is Los Alamos. Leslie Groves was head of the Army Corps of Engineers, General Groves. He was in overall charge. Robert Oppenheimer was charged of the actual assembly of it, and they worked fairly well together. If you ever get a chance, Los Alamos is really cool. It's got a great museum. It's beautiful. I love the high desert of New Mexico. I highly recommend it. Well, these are all the spots it was constructed at. Los Alamos right here. For example, the TVA, remember the Tennessee Valley Authority, that provided the electricity for the uranium separation right here at Oak Ridge. And up here in Hanford, that is where they had the first sustainable nuclear reactor to make plutonium. Grant Cooley did to get the electricity from the New Deal. Well, they've constructed two different bombs. One's called the uranium gun weapon, and they were 99% that would work. The other one was the plutonium bomb. We call it today, you hear called a Trinity bomb. That was a code name for the first explosion. And it was a ball, perfect sphere of plutonium with deuterium in the middle, surrounded by explosive charges to explode and to concentrate the explosion into one to make a chain reaction. That is Trinity. And that would be the first atomic bomb exploded. And they weren't sure if it was going to work, or for that matter, they weren't sure if it was going to cause a chain reaction in the atmosphere and blow the world up. But they rolled the dice and blew it up anyways. They thought 5 to 10 kilotons. That's 5 to 10,000 tons of TNT. It turned out to be 21 kilotons. Significantly bigger than they thought. An awesome explosion. They had enough plutonium for one more bomb, and they had the uranium gun bomb. And as soon as this worked, Truman had nothing to do with this decision. They were sent to Tinian Island to prepare to be dropped. While that's going on,